This episode of the Small Triumph Sports Library and Archives channel is an unplanned one, revolving around a fault that developed with my Spitfire when I was recently out driving. Grappling with that problem actually caused me to think about several different maintenance/replacement part type issues that I've encountered fairly recently. And then I thought maybe it would be a good idea to cover those issues in a video. I thought maybe talking about some of that may be of some value to some of you out there. As such, this video is going to have something of a random quality to it, not stream of consciousness or free association or anything quite like that, but a little bit of a random quality to it. Consequently, I am going to break this video down into clear segments, and I'm going to begin with the bout of Spitfire Electrickery that I recently encountered, which is, as I record this video, an unsolved mystery. So this story begins when I decided to take my Spitfire out for a drive probably about a week and a half ago now. I had not had the car out for a few weeks. I had a club meeting coming up on Saturday that I was hoping to make, and I thought it would be a good idea to get the car out the garage. It was a beautiful spring day, unusually cool. I thought it would be great to get the car out, put some gas in it, run some errands, just have a nice day. So I left my house and headed down to the gas station that's it's maybe a mile from my house. And I filled up the car with non-ethanol gasoline, and everything was normal, by which I simply mean that there was no sense that anything was amiss. So I cranked the car up, starts right up, pull away from the fuel pump. I am moving toward the exit of the gas station, heading to the road. And as I approach the exit, as I approach the road, the car all of a sudden dies. And I don't mean it stumbled and stalled or anything like that. I mean it just flat out died. I had no power whatsoever. No dash warning lights, the radio was out, everything was off. And this was bewildering to me. I remember just kind of looking around for a second. I remember glancing at the rearview mirror, seeing there was no one behind me, and so allowing myself to roll backwards gently a little bit as I kind of looked around and tried to gather my thoughts. The car has done many things over the 38 plus years that I've owned it, but it's never done that. I don't remember what I did, to be honest with you, but I'm pretty confident that I messed with the key. I'm pretty sure I toggled the key at least between the auxiliary and ignition positions, and the power came back. The radio started playing again, the dash lights came on, I was able to crank the car back up. Now at this point, obviously there's a problem with the car, so I decided I was going to just take it straight home. It was a fairly short trip, so there didn't seem to be a lot of risk involved in that. So I drove the car straight home, and everything was normal during that 1 mile drive home. I got it in my driveway, it was still running fine. I shut it down. And at this point, I decided I wanted to see if messing with the key would cause the fault to occur again. I kind of immediately got the idea that there was something going on with the ignition switch, which may or may not make perfect sense. And I knew in the back of my mind there could be any number of other things going on. You know, bad connection at the battery, or loose connection at the battery, or bad ground, or any number of different things. But I decided I would mess with the key and see if I could get the problem to occur again. I decided I would video this mainly because when I encounter any kind of electrical issue that involves doing some sleuthing, I always consult with my father. My dad's a master electrician by trade. He's retired now, but he's a master electrician, and I always lean heavily on him when I'm dealing with any kind of electrical problem that requires some digging to figure out. So I wanted to go ahead and record what was going on, see if I could capture it on video, just as an initial step, as a baby step in trying to diagnose what the problem was. So I'm about to show you that video. I want to go ahead and emphasize that what happens is you'll see the first couple of times that maybe just the first time, I toggle the switch between auxiliary and ignition. Everything's normal. The radios play in. You see the dash lights come on when it goes to ignition. I think it's the second time that the power drops. I think it flickers and drops all together. And then after that, the next several times I do it, it is pretty much normal. Hopefully there are no copyright issues with this little video, because there is a song playing in the background intermittently as I mess with the key. I had a random mix of tunes playing at the time, and the radio noise is obviously important in terms of being an indicator of what's going on. So here's the video. And that's my little video. Doesn't tell you much. It provides a sense of the symptoms I was experiencing. It obviously does not give any indication about root cause. So I called up my father. I told him what I had experienced. Tried to send him that video via text message, which didn't go very well. The version that came through to him was pretty low quality. So I ended up showing him the HD video on my phone the next time we were together. But he, as always, said, he's happy to help. He'd come over and, we would diagnose it, which he's always helped me. And we're approaching Father's Day here, and it's a good opportunity for me to acknowledge that my dad has helped me a lot over the years. I would not have survived without him in the early years with my cars and motorcycles, when I had no idea about anything. But even as I've gained a great deal of knowledge over the years, still with plenty of holes in it, but even as I've gained a great deal of knowledge over the years, Dad has always been a tremendous help. I've already mentioned he's my go-to person for electrical issues, and plus overall, doubtless my passion for cars and motorcycles is owed in some large part to him and his passion for those things as I was growing up. So Dad, as always, said, I'll come over, I'll help you, we'll figure it out. And so I figured I'd just wait on him. He is, again, the expert on electrical issues. So we arranged a day for him to come over. I rolled the car out. I pulled the nacelle off from behind the steering wheel to expose the wiring and the ignition switch and all of that. And Dad came over, and we spent about an hour and a half going over the car. Dad was testing connections. We looked at switches. We were looking at bullet connectors. We're looking at all kinds of things. Checked the battery connections, checked the grounds, looked at the fuse box. Problem is, the entire time that we were looking over my car, It functioned perfectly normally. No electrical problems whatsoever. Every time we turned the switch, the ignition came on, the car started, it ran fine. I ran it for a while, let it get hot, no problems whatsoever. So it was a hopeless business. I mean, you can't diagnose an electrical fault in a system that is functioning perfectly normally. And so we had to, at some point, give up. I even ran the car for a while after Dad left, and it behaved perfectly normally. This is discouraging because it means, unfortunately, that I'm going to have to drive the car until the fault happens again, at which point then I or we can go in and diagnose it. But that doesn't put me in a very good position, because I don't know how long it's going to be before this particular fault occurs again. I only feel very strongly, given history, given evidence with these types of things, that it is going to happen again. I don't think it's something that has miraculously cured itself. And in the back of my mind, I have this worst case scenario that the car is just going to function perfectly normally for another 300 miles or so. 300 miles of anxiety-ridden driving before it happens again. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm not very happy about it. Unfortunately, some of this may be karma, because I've been able to brag that my Spitfire has had few electrical problems over the years. I've mentioned before in previous videos that my Spitfire was my only car between 1991 and 1998, and I drove it a lot, and I drove it all over the place. During part of that time, I was in grad school, 6 hours away, and I drove back and forth regularly. The only major mishap I had in all that time was the overdrive switch shorted, and I ended up having to drive home without overdrive about half of the trip or something like that. But by and large, the car's been very good to me. I've had, items that wear or break, go out. I've had alternators go out, starter solenoids gone out, different things like that have happened. And I have had a few electrical gremlins pop up, especially lately, now that I drive the car less and less. Within the last couple of years, the electric fan wasn't coming on. Had to figure that one out. But by and large, I've had few electrical problems, and the ones that I've had have been pretty minor. But this, driving along and losing all power all of a sudden, is not exactly minor. So I will provide an update on my Spitfire electrical problem when I have one. I feel like my father and I were quite thorough when we were investigating it together. We looked at pretty much everything, started the car, jiggled wires while the car was running, messed with all sorts of things. I don't know. But I also know that sometimes, for whatever reason, the most obvious things get missed, and it's worth double checking or triple checking everything. Who knows? Maybe something obvious was completely overlooked. I have not driven the car. I have not had it out on the road since my first experience with the problem at the gas station. I'm going to have to take it out again as long as it continues to function normally, and I'll take it out on some short drives and see what happens. We've had a good bit of rain lately, and I've been tied up with a variety of different things, and so I haven't gotten it out on the road yet, but will happen soon. While we were investigating the power dropping in the car, we looked carefully at the fuse box, and that reminded me of something that I thought would be worth covering. A real problem area with Spitfire and GT6 fuse boxes, and probably with other Triumph fuse boxes or British fuse boxes in general, is that as they age, the fuse holder clips tend to give up. They break, and then they don't have a tight connection to the fuse anymore, and you end up with a circuit that drops out intermittently, if not, entirely. This problem happened with my Spitfire going a ways back. It has to be at least 15 years ago or more. I had a fuse clip that gave up, with the expected symptoms. And my father actually dug into his electrical supplies, and he pulled out one of these electrical fuse holder clips, as you see on your screen here. And he suggested to me that I take this clip and put it over all of the clips in my fuse box backwards in order to hold the fuse holder clips tightly on the fuses. This was, of course, a fix for the broken fuse holder clip in the fuse box, but I also put it over all of the clips in the fuse box as a precaution. My car has been run that way for about, like I said, maybe 15 years now. It's a great short-term solution. It's not an ideal long-term solution, but Spitfire and GT6 fuse boxes are a little bit of a pain to replace. It's not simply a plug-and-play thing, not the least of which because part of the wiring harness runs through the plastic body of the fuse box. It's a little bit of a complicated situation. So it's not a simple thing. So I inserted these fuse clips over the fuse clips in the fuse box, and my fuse box has been this way for quite some time, and my fuse box does not seem to be the problem with the current electrickery that I've been experiencing. Here's a quick video of what my fuse box looks like. Now, of course, past performance for me is not necessarily indicative of future results for you. You should do whatever you're most comfortable with. But this fix has worked for me in a relatively long-term way, and I think it is an excellent short-term fix if you have a problem with your fuse box and you don't have the time or the inclination to do the work that is involved in swapping out your fuse box. It'll keep you on the road. I've taken to recommending this in online communities. I recommend that people have a handful of those fuse clips, keep them in the parcel tray, keep them in the toolkit, in the boot of your car, just in case one of your fuse box clips, one of them gives up while you're out on the road, or maybe more than one of them gives up when you're out on the road. It's a very easy and simple way to keep you going. While I'm on the subject of fuse boxes and fuses, I want to go ahead and talk briefly about something that those of you who have been into Triumphs for a long time doubtless know, but some of you who are newer to the hobby may not be aware of, and that is the difference between British fuse ratings and American fuse ratings. It's really important to understand that here in America, you can't just go down to your local auto parts store and buy a fuse that is precisely what Triumph prescribes in the owner's handbook. British fuse ratings as prescribed by Triumph and the fuses at your local auto parts store are different. You want to get British or English rated fuses. Generally speaking, your favorite vendor, specialist, part supplier should have British rated fuses. If not, or if you just need to get a hold of a fuse quickly, be sure to consult a British/American conversion chart for fuses to make sure that you are using a fuse with a safe rating for your vehicle. I'm not going to go into the difference between these fuses in tremendous detail. That information is out there on the internet, just one internet search away. But I will go ahead and share a conversion chart here. So this is a conversion chart that I've relied upon over the years. It's in a document that I downloaded some time ago, and it is one Triumph enthusiast's modifications of a conversion chart that allegedly originally appeared in an old busman catalog. So on the left-hand side there, you can see the ratings for the English type, the British type, the old Lucas type of fuse. And on the right-hand column, you see the American standard replacement, the equivalent fuse when it comes to American standard replacements. Probably the most common fuse encountered in Triumphs, certainly with the fuse boxes of Spitfires and GT6s, is the 35 amp fuse. And you can see from this chart that the 35 amp British style fuse, the equivalent, the American standard replacement equivalent, to use the terminology of this chart, is a 20 amp fuse. Do note that there is some disagreement about what the exact best equivalent is. So here's another chart I found on the internet. Here the argument is that a 35 amp British Lucas fuse, the equivalent American bus fuse, is 17 amps. So you will find some quibbling about these things. Obviously the best thing to do is to go to your vendor and get a British rated fuse. That's what I've been doing for quite some time now. However, if you need to get a fuse in a pinch, use a conversion chart. Do a little homework and make sure that you're choosing something that is appropriate for your car. This brings me to another issue that came up while investigating the loss of power in the Spitfire. While Dad and I were poking around the car, I noticed that fuel was pooling around, on top of and around the fuel pump on the car. I've seen some variation on that theme at least a half dozen times over the years, so I knew that it was time for a new fuel pump. First thing you always have to do is, check your oil level, check your dipstick, make sure that your fuel pump hasn't ruptured in such a way that it is dumping fuel into your oil, your engine, which I've never had happen, but you always want to make absolutely sure, and that wasn't a problem this time. Beyond that, changing a fuel pump is pretty simple business, except for that it's a little bit messy because there's not really a good way to do it without spilling at least some fuel all over the place. At least that's been my experience. I always keep a spare fuel pump in the boot of my car, and I usually have yet another fuel pump in my part stash. Quality of fuel pumps these days is not always the best. They don't always last for a long time, and that's really the subject of this segment of this video. I went back and looked at my records, and the fuel pump that I took off recently, I installed in 2013, which is pretty good. 10 years of occasional driving. I'm perfectly happy with that, but I remembered the backstory behind this. The pump that I pulled off in 2013 was one that had only worked for a few years, and it was one that I wasn't crazy about the design. Let me go to an image here. Now, first of all, let me be clear. My car is a 1980 Spitfire, is a late Spitfire. It has the long arm pump on it that uses a spacer. Earlier Spitfires use short arm pumps with no spacer. What I'm talking about probably applies to both types of pumps, but I just want to be clear, I'm specifically talking about the long arm pump. So the pump that I pulled off my car in 2013 was of the design that you see on your screen here. This is what I'll refer to as a blade type arm. It's just a flat arm. Just a few images of it there. As far as I can tell, just looking at vendors that have pictures of their products online, this is really the only type of pump that's available now. I had this on the car in 2013 and I didn't like it. And there may be more than one maker of pumps, or there may have been at the time more than one maker of pumps using these blade armed pumps. But I didn't really like it. It didn't last very long. So I didn't think it was a very high quality pump. And so I went out and looked long and hard for a pump like this one. This is actually the one I just pulled off the car. Let me go ahead and show you. What I found was this. All right, so Beck Arnley pump. And this is the one that just failed. And as you can see here, this has a curved formed arm. You can actually see that you get like a nice contact patch here from the cam lobe driving the fuel pump on the end. But I like this style pump a lot better. I'm not saying it necessarily works better. It's nicer. There is something kind of reassuring about that arm that looks a little more substantial and has the very flat contact patch for the cam. And I remember that I had to shop around, and I did a lot of work to find a pump like that one, and I had almost exclusively used pumps like that previously. Disappointingly, that Beck Arnley unit is shown as no longer available, out of stock, all of that at every vendor. Actually, I think I bought that off Amazon back in 2013, but it's no longer available. And the only pumps that I see for sale now are of the blade type, have the blade type arms. The problem that I actually had with my previous blade type arm is that it seemed, or I suspected, you notice on this here, when you look at the profile, you can see how it kind of rests at about the spot you would expect. Some of the blade type ones seem to dip down almost below where the spacer and the block would be here. And I almost think it levers on that a little bit. I know my previous blade type ones seem to want to wiggle loose. I mean, they come a little bit loose after miles and miles of use anyway. So you have to go in and kind of tighten up the bolts. But that particular one seemed to want to wiggle loose kind of frequently. And I noticed it because I had oil leaks off of that side of the block. It can be remedied probably just by pulling the thing out and grinding on it a little bit, but you shouldn't have to do that. The pump that I put on this time, I didn't have any other recourse. I actually do have one pump like this brand new, that's in the trunk of the car, which I'd forgotten that it was of that type. But I pulled the pump that I had in my part stash where I had to wave the white flag and buy one with a blade type arm. And I put that on the car this time, and it started up, and it's worked so far. Of course, I haven't put any miles on it yet, so we'll see how it does. Again, I hear a lot of complaining about the quality of fuel pumps these days. A lot of that has to do with fuel pressure. Some people claim the fuel pressure is too high and this and that and the other. But to me, it's just kind of a reminder of something that we all know, which is that the quality of the parts available to us are constantly getting worse and worse. And that's, you know, fuel pumps are part of that general trend ultimately. I laughed. I found while I was digging through my parts this box, which is actually an Italian fuel pump that I bought many years ago for the Spitfire. Actually, the description of the part is in Italian, but you know, those days are kind of gone, unfortunately. But I'm very disappointed in it. I know a lot of people go with electric fuel pumps. I don't really want to do that. You know, do it as last resort. I know it's effective, but I don't really want to do that except for as a last resort. I like the simplicity of the mechanical fuel pump. I don't know. We'll see what the future holds. All right, I'm going to try to make this one quick because this video is getting longer than I intended, but it is sort of a continuation on the theme of diminishing quality of parts, a theme that I hate, but one that we all lament. But I have a very specific story that just seemed very loosely related to the fuel pump story that I wanted to share. This actually begins back in about 2015. I was working on the Spitfire and I noticed the not altogether unfamiliar drip, drip, drip of coolant from the weep hole in the water pump. And so it was time to replace the water pump. At the time I was shopping more on price point, and I ended up just very quickly ordering a water pump from one of the major vendors in the US. There is a long and complicated backstory there. That particular vendor at the time, and maybe still does, insist that Ep8.Jun23 is the correct water pump for the 1979 and 1980 Spitfire. That does not match what the factory parts catalog says, and it's not the water pump that I traditionally used. But I did get good customer service from that vendor when I had to swap out the water pumps, and I'm not going to complain about that, even though neither of the water pumps they sent me ended up working. What I really wanted to share here was something about two specific parts. One thing that really astonished me is that when I got from the vendor the correct water pump, Ep8.Jun23, I went to install it and realized that the base of the water pump that the studs go through was much thicker than on the one that I pulled out. And let me illustrate this for you. That's the difference. The one on the left is the Ep8.Jun23 that I pulled off of my car, and the one on the right is Ep8.Jun23 that I received from the vendor. There was a little problem that was made worse by me, because one of the things that I typically do when I replace a water pump is I replace the hardware, and I got a nut from a different vendor that was faulty, and I ended up messing up one of my water pump studs. The one there on the left, you can see that the threads at the end are flattened out. I can't remember if that's precisely what the bad nut did, or if that happened with the, I think I ended up using a stud extractor that was not really correct for the application. But either way, the original stud is on the left. I just thought the simplest thing to do, this ended up being a much bigger operation than I intended, was to order a replacement stud. Well, That didn't work out either. I ordered studs from 2 or 3 different vendors. It's an inexpensive part. And all of them were like the one on the right, which is, as you can see, significantly shorter than the other one. The threads that go into the water pump housing are about the same, but the threads that protrude from the water pump housing are much shorter. There are much fewer threads there. And when I went to install the water pump with the thicker base from the vendor, and I used the replacement stud, you notice the original studs there are on the top, and they protrude not nearly as much as I would like, not as much as I'm comfortable with, but they do protrude out. But notice where the replacement stud is at the bottom. There's maybe a thread or 2 showing. So ultimately what I ended up doing, I mean, obviously I needed to try to repair the original stud, but I didn't do that until much later. I ended up having to shop around for a different water pump, and I eventually found a vendor who had a county water pump that had a base of the same thickness as the one that I pulled off. That was something that just took me totally off guard. Like, I went to put the water pump on and I expected it to be the same as the other one, and as you can see from the photograph, it's not. It had a much thicker base. Frankly, even with the original studs on there, there's not really as much thread showing as I would like to see, and I wouldn't be completely comfortable with it. But that replacement stud, there wasn't even enough to get a nut started on it. It was completely ridiculous, and again shows the lack of attention to detail when it comes to these reproduction parts. It also informed how I operated going forward. As I've worked on my GT6 restoration project, I sent the original water pump off that car to Flying Dutchman to have it rebuilt. And while I was at it, I dug through my parts for the Spitfire, and I remembered that early on in my time with the Spitfire, I ordered a water pump from one of the major vendors, and it was actually a stand part water pump. And I kept that, and I'm glad that I did, because I sent that water pump off to Flying Dutchman and had it rebuilt with the upgraded option here. But this is actually a nice original stand part water pump that I now have for the Spitfire. I have it in my part stash. I'm not going to take off a perfectly good functioning water pump off the Spitfire just to put this on. But it is in my part stash when needed, and I'm more inclined to move in that direction now, especially because it can allow you to preserve the original parts. But dealing with the kind of frustrating issues I dealt with this water pump issue, remember, I was trying to save money, and I ended up spending a lot more money and a lot more time trying to sort that than would have been the case if the parts had been correct. So just a little story there. All right, that's it for this episode, this too long episode of the Small Triumph Sports Library and Archives channel. I am going to go ahead and drink a beer here. Westbrook's Goza, excellent summertime beer, and knock off for the evening. I am going to have another episode coming up. I got a kind of a fun digression episode that I plan to get out pretty soon, certainly within the next week. And one of the main things I'm going to be working on coming up is an update regarding progress with my GT6 restoration project. If anybody has any comments about anything, please throw them at me. Maybe I'm terribly wrong about something. That's great. Tell me. I want to hear about it. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in any of this kind of stuff, please do consider liking and subscribing. And till next time.